So I'm going to show you right now how to basically gather some resources and prepare your presentation for one of these pollination papers. The same would apply for one of the seed dispersal papers. Basically, we're looking to turn a paper, a publication, into more of a visual presentation. So that's what I'll be doing here. So I'm just going to kind of wing it and hopefully show you that it doesn't take a lot of time to do this, working on a paper that I've browsed a little bit. So I'm choosing this paper, potential role of lava lizards as pollinators across the Galapagos Islands. So I started off with the outline. This is suggested components you might want to include. So if you're going to make a visual presentation about pollination, you may not have video or photographs of the pollinator in action, but you should be able to get some photographs from the web of flowers involved, the plant species involved, and then the animal species involved, and kind of relate those or use in your presentation, kind of relate them to each other. If you can get original photographs of pollination happening, that's great to add. You don't necessarily need that as part of your project. Just looking to kind of put a visual spin on the whole thing. So I started off, I took this outline that I've given you. It's a suggested outline. You don't have to hit all the bullet points, but I think it's a good set of basics to get there. And I already pasted them over to save us a little bit of time. So I put the title of my presentation and then a citation for the paper that it's relating to. And then just I left some spaces here. I'm working in Google Slides right now. One for the plant species, one for the animal species, the hypothesis in the paper, and then some data from the paper. So again, a nice emphasis on scientific evidence for what we're presenting here. So let's go over to the paper, and it talks about lizards. So the lizards that they're talking about are present on the Galapagos Islands. And so those are, in this case, it's a group that has radiated. So a group of lizards, you might have heard about the Galapagos finches. So it's not uncommon for the Galapagos Islands, these islands in the ocean that are separated by a considerable, pretty big distance for small animals. They're basically like independent zones of rapid evolution sometimes. So that's our target group of animals, so-called lava lizards. And the paper includes some photographs of them. You might be able to grab some of these, for example, and use those in the paper. These are actual lizards visiting plants. And then they mention a variety of plant species. So again, these papers are going to be pretty heavy on the scientific names, and I think it's a good chance to get familiar with what is being talked about here. So let's start doing some web searches. So I'm just going to pull up, the first thing I'm going to do, I thought about this paper being that it talks about the Galapagos Islands. If somebody's not familiar with those, that'd be an important thing to talk about. So you could get a map of the Galapagos Islands, or you could grab it from the internet. So this is them. You probably heard about the Galapagos before. They are just about on the equator, and their closest land mass political state is Ecuador. And the fact that they're way out there in the ocean in a tropical climate gives them a really unique place for evolution to happen. I'm going to use a feature that I know the keyboard shortcut to on my Mac, and I don't know that I could find a menu item for it. But hopefully you're familiar maybe with screen capture. So there's on my Mac, Shift Command 4 changes my cursor to this grabby bit, and I can draw a box around what I want to grab. And for me, it ends up going to my desktop folder. So that was South America relative to the Galapagos, and then maybe worth zooming in here. And I know some of these, okay. So if I zoom in far enough, I get the names on those. I'm going to do another screen capture here and grab those with the names of the islands on there. And then I might just start with a new start with a new slide that introduces the geography. For this paper, it's pretty important to the story, I think. So in Google Slides, I can highlight more than one image and it'll pull them both in, which is nice. And I could do a little side by side here. South America with the Galapagos. I don't want to take up all the time, but if I had more time on this, I would maybe draw a little box and indicate that this zone here with the Galapagos Islands is what's being blown up over here. And why don't we go look for some images? I'm going to go to Google Images, and I'm going to do a search on the scientific name. So a nice benefit on the internet of searching by scientific names is you don't get thrown off by other organisms that have similar or competing common names. So lava lizard, I don't know how many things out there are called lava lizard, but I know scientifically there should be only one genus of related organisms that are called Microlophus. So I guess I'm a little curious as to what Wikipedia has, so I can scoot over to Wikipedia. That's pretty handy. This is a Wikipedia version of all these different species of Microlophus, and lots of them are mentioned. And I'll see if I can get some photos of these, but basically they are in the Galapagos, different species on different islands. So Hispaniola, Delanonis, and that would be the Hispaniola lava lizard. So I can do right click or control click on my Mac. It's actually pretty friendly with Google Slides. You can just do copy here, and I'm gonna do maybe animals first. So this, a lot of the papers I've given you to work with are specialized on a particular plant species. This one covers a variety of animal species. And I'm sorry, one focal animal species, and highlights. All right. Oh, way down there, Española. I don't know my Galapagos. So this paper is more focused on the lizards to begin with. In an ideal situation, you would be able to give credit to the people who took these lovely photographs. I kind of let that slide for myself. If you're ever presenting in a conference, or certainly if you ever go to publication and you want to make something a little more permanent to a larger audience, you want to give credit and get permission for all these photographs. But for our small audience and temporary presentations, it's not a big deal for us. All right, so you could, if you wanted to, take your animals and attach them to islands. Make my line bigger. All right, we got a lizard that lives on this island. Let's see what else we've learned. Okay, so the gist of this paper is they studied lizards and they captured them and they looked for pollen that was on the body of the lizards that they could then identify to plant species that were known to grow in the area. They had a minimum threshold of 5 pollen grains, so they had to have a substantial amount of pollen grains on them. One that might be connected to pollination, effective pollination. They didn't go so far in the study, so I gave the better papers to the students, and this was one that I happened to have that was interesting, but didn't have like definitive evidence that these animals are pollinating. But we did have pretty good evidence that they're carrying the pollen, so pretty good, good as a start. Okay, so we had this little lizard on Española, and a couple of plant species also on Española. And here we have 204 pollen grains found. That seems like pretty substantial. Prosopis is the genus that mesquite is in, so you might recognize this, might not. Again, Wikipedia, pretty good source for images. Actually, that one looks kind of nice. All right, back to the first one. There we go. I'm just gonna copy again and paste. So one of the big things I want you to get out of this, or maybe keep an eye out for as you're doing this project, is kind of connecting the pieces. So I don't know lizard behavior very well, but this lizard that's now shown on the ground is kind of faced with the challenge of pollinating or visiting the flowers on this tree or shrub that are a pretty big distance off the ground. So maybe a not accidental connection between those species. If you're giving your presentation, you might put some labels on these. And I forget what it's called already. Prosopis uliflora. A little smaller, make it in italics, make it a different color. Okay, so we have that one. I'll go ahead and just maybe focus on Española for now. Another plant species, Sesuvium. Interesting. All right, there's some flowers. So rather different, an entirely different kind of plant here. This is a succulent plant close to the ground. So the other one was a tree species. This is a ground-lying succulent species. And the paper says not a lot. So this was like just a minimum of pollen grains from this species. Still kind of interesting that that would be carried around by the old lizard. So I suppose to do this as a complete presentation, you might continue to get images of the maybe each interaction set by island. Again, I just think it's interesting to be able to put these together. So I don't know what would be in common between these, but maybe lizards get around and they are visiting whatever they can get their food source from. Let's see, put a name on that one. There we go. And I guess we can't leave our lizard out. We'll put a name on that one too. Microlophus. Okay, so here I've got a slide that basically highlights this one island's interactions. You could maybe indicate stronger connection of the, so say I'm gonna maybe, I don't know, let me try a different one. You could take the data and actually show the data connected to this. So here we have the island and those animal and plant species that are involved. Just maybe if I was giving the presentation part of this, highlight the fact that there were a lot more pollen grains of this species than there were of this species found on that lizard. And then a couple others, other species. So on the island of Pinta, 105 pollen grains from this species found on the lizard. They mention in here feeding on pollen and nectar and flowers of prickly pear cactus. So that one's interesting. Just don't see this in the data, so you could, if you want to grab an original image from the paper, let's see. I think nope. You can web search your citation, search for the title of the paper. I'm going to see if I can find on the publisher's website maybe an original high quality copy of this image. Full access, all right. Looks like full access, but only PDF. So, looks like the quality of the image on the PDF is as good as I'm gonna get. Again, I can probably just do a screen grab of this one. So with digital images, you can zoom in, and then at some point, looks like before this, we've really lost our resolution. So zooming in anymore, we could do that, but it's not getting any sharper. So the sharpest we get is maybe here. It's certainly not the worst. So I can take this, I have the whole thing in frame, and I can do one screen capture of that. Frame that up. And that one maybe not. Could be part of the introductory slide. Do kind of look for your own images, Microlophus, pollinating. All right, well, I got lizards or pollinating, not both. All right. Well, some beautiful photos of lava lizards here. Okay, so I've got the geography, I've got the animals and plants. Again, it's sort of distinct. The common thread is that the lizards are all in the same genus, but there's a different species on each island, and there are different plant species on each island. I didn't see a lot of overlap even in the plant group. So there's not necessarily even related plants in a lot of these cases. Here's one in the same genus, Sesuvium. Here's another Sesuvium that's a lot more pollen grains found on the island of Santa Cruz. Maybe Santa Cruz. Oh, there we go. Santa Cruz, not Santa Cruz. But this would be a similar plant with more pollen grains associated on that other island on a different. Santa Cruz would have this other lizard species, Indefatigabilis. So a little bit of commonality. This might be worth pointing out. A couple of Sesuvium, a couple of plants in the genus Cordia. Also pretty good pollen transport. I'm a little curious to see what these different plant species look like. All right, so individual, here's a website devoted to Galapagos plants. That one looks very lovely. So you might find something different. It's a little surprising to me. It seems that there's a pretty big variety in the kinds of flowers we see here. That might even be worth commenting on as you're putting your presentation together. For this paper, I think you probably it wouldn't be too difficult to grab images of all the lizards and all the flowers and just kind of present that across the diversity of what's there. Maybe comment on the commonalities. So again, this paper, they didn't do manipulations, they didn't do pollinator exclusion, they didn't evaluate how well the lizards were actually pollinating. That would all be, if you have a paper you're working on, that's something to include is the evidence. So for mine, I did kind of lizard and plant species together. Change my title. And I guess I could do different ones of these. Different slide for each island. That's possible. So maybe take that out. Hypothesis, lava lizards have been collected pollen on their bodies. There are different species of lava lizard. Say hypothesis or lizards capable of carrying pollen. Something like that. Data, you might have something more substantial than this, but I'm just gonna grab the table and put it in here. Maybe do a summary of that. And if you wanted to, you could highlight and then talk about if you have some part of your data that are more noteworthy than others. So I'm just going to do a little box around there, make it a bigger box. So these numbers that are bigger, some of those smaller numbers you might be able to write off as coincidence, but lizards carrying 105 pollen grains on them. Now this is 105 over 4 animals that were caught, but more interesting, you know, if you catch 4 lizards and they all have some amount of pollen on them, that starts to build a pattern. So the Galapagos, hard to get food around the Galapagos, and I imagine if there's a flower offering a nectar reward, then these lizards would be interested in visiting, and then during that process they might be getting some pollen on themselves. I didn't talk too much about the methods. Basically collecting lizards, they did a little part where they took it's kind of like a Jello cube and rubbed it over the surface of the lizard to look for the pollen grains. So you talk about that. Just kind of, again, put a visual component to this. I think I've covered it pretty well. I don't want to give you the idea that this is a really involved process either. So basically just grab the information out of the paper you're looking at, turn it into visuals, and explain the big, the high points of the paper to your audience. So I won't make a separate example presentation file, but I think I've kind of talked about what I would say in a presentation as I showed you how to put this together. So hopefully you're a little better prepared to do this. I'm excited to see what you come up with for your own presentations.